COVID-19 has caused a surge in global unemployment like we've never seen before. But in the US, jobs have disappeared faster than in any other developed country. And then in May, America's unemployment rate began to rebound, while in other developed nations, it remained relatively stable.
The US also creates a ton of jobs because it's easier to fire people. Businesses are more confident to hire people. So you'd expect the flexible labor markets to move more, I suppose, in response to changes in demand.
In May and June, the US added about 7.5 million jobs, but the unemployment rate is still at the highest level since the Depression. As the pandemic has put us in uncharted territory, we wanted to know, will American jobs bounce back faster than the rest of the world? First, it's important to understand what difference a flexible labor market can make.
In Europe, there's more of a sense that the company has to have a very strong reason to be able to fire someone, whereas in the US, I think it's much more of a normal part of business.
A flexible labor market has its pros and cons, and proponents say in normal times, it helps keep unemployment low by making it easy for people to move between jobs. Just look at the difference in how long people stay at their jobs in the US versus Germany.
Yeah, it's a different mentality. In Germany, it's not a job for life, but the average employment tenure is 10 years at a single company compared with 4.2, I think it is in the US.
After the 2008 financial crisis, the US unemployment rate recovered faster than Europe's, which also went through a debt crisis. So it makes sense that a more flexible labor market would see a bigger jump in unemployment during a recession, since it's easier for companies to lay off employees when demand falls. But if you look at what happened at the start of the pandemic, you'll see two very different outcomes for two job markets economists deem flexible. The US saw unemployment rise roughly 11 percentage points from January to April, while Japan's unemployment rate grew half a percentage point. That's where different pandemic strategies come in. In short, the US chose to give money directly to workers while the economy reboots, while others like Japan and Europe opted to subsidize companies and protect jobs.
Canada and the US, I think, have been among the ones that have seen the biggest jump. The main reason, I suppose, is because they've tried to protect workers rather than jobs. They haven't gone for these job furlough schemes on a grand scale, as the Europeans have.
As part of its first stimulus package, lawmakers sent Americans a $1,200 one-time stimulus check and added $600 a week to unemployment benefits, effectively accepting a wave of job losses. They also funded key industries like aviation to try and prevent or delay some layoffs. Meanwhile, Japan's government allocated nearly $700 billion to business financing and enacted a program to subsidize up to around $140 a day in wages for furloughed employees. The EU has invested roughly $120 billion in similar short-term work schemes. Since those employees are still on the books, even if they're not working, they're not counted as unemployed. That works well for those lucky enough to have a permanent job, but it comes at the cost of very high unemployment for young people in some countries, or those on temporary contracts.
I was speaking to people on furlough, and it's essentially a holiday. Obviously, there's nervousness, there's concern about the pandemic, but people are spending their time doing sports or meeting with friends. It's a very different experience being without work in Europe at the moment than in the US.
But the question is, how long can it last?
The labor cost is only part of what companies are paying. You still have to pay for the premises, and there's other fees that you have to pay, and you've got no income. So at some point, you'll still have to pull the plug and let those employees go.
That breaking point is going to depend on how fast economies can recover. The longer the pandemic drags on, the more companies could go bust, erasing jobs that likely won't be immediately replaced. In June, the IMF projected the global economy to grow 5.4% next year, but said recovery is still uncertain.
In the next 2 or 3 years, we'll see which response was better. But traditionally, the US labor market has been much more dynamic in kind of reallocating to growth industries.
Just look at how the US stock market has outperformed Japan and Europe. Some big American companies have done really well throughout the pandemic, and there are high hopes that the companies that have done well will decide to create jobs. While Europe and Japan have kept unemployment rates relatively stable so far, they risk supporting jobs that might not be as valuable by the time the pandemic ends. Think aviation, or German auto workers producing parts for engines that will likely be phased out.
Will you want to have exactly the same jobs in place 2 years down the line? Probably not.
Germany recently allocated $12 billion to expand its job support program until the end of 2021. But the future of US business support is still unclear, as lawmakers have to regularly assess and approve stimulus packages.
There's just so much uncertainty about how long this is going to last. The next big debate is going to be about the exit strategy and how to phase out some of these programs.
Even if the US unemployment rate keeps falling, the CBO predicts it'll take more than a decade to reach pre-pandemic levels. While other developed countries haven't made such long-term projections yet, the ECB forecasts that unemployment in the Eurozone will still be above pre-pandemic levels in 2022. A full economic recovery from this pandemic is going to take years, and by the time it's all over, we may be looking at very different labor markets around the world.